Thomas Aldridge's father told him one thing when he handed over the east pasture. The animal's attention is information. Follow it. Thomas spent 52 years following it. His son installed a $180,000 monitoring system to replace what his father knew. The system lasted 48 hours in a February ice storm. The storm lasted 72. In the 24 hours the system was dead, Thomas found 5 cattle in the dark by reading the direction 200 animals were facing. The system tracked the separated animals. Thomas tracked what the herd knew about where they'd gone. Those are not the same thing. His son understood this on a Friday morning in February 2019. He had 4 years left to learn it properly. This is the story of what 4 years can save, and what it costs to start later than you should. A herd of cattle is not a collection of animals. This is the first thing that a stockman learns, and it takes years to learn it properly, because the evidence for it is not in any single observation but in the accumulation of observations over time. A herd is a system. It has a memory that is distributed across the individuals that compose it, a collective awareness of the landscape, the weather, the location of water and shelter, the history of predator approaches and human activity in this specific place. This awareness is not conscious in the way that human awareness is conscious. It is something older and more efficient, a continuous processing of environmental signals, coordinated through behavior, that allows the herd to respond to threats and opportunities faster than any individual animal could respond alone. The language of this system is behavior. Posture and movement and orientation and proximity and the specific quality of attention that a bovine directs at something it has noticed and not yet decided what to do about. The language is not metaphorical. It is a real information channel, and it carries real information, and the information can be read by a person who has spent enough time learning to read it. Thomas Aldridge had been reading this language for 52 years. He was 72 years old in the winter of 2019, and he had been running cattle in the Flint Hills of Kansas since he was 20 years old, on the same 200 acres that his grandfather had purchased in 1921 and that had been in continuous cattle production since. He had spent 52 years watching the specific herd that grazed these specific pastures, and he had built, through that watching, a knowledge of bovine behavior that was not general, it was specific to this herd, on this land, in these conditions. His son David had installed the RFID or tag monitoring system in September 2018. $180,000 in hardware and software. Each animal tagged and enrolled. The system tracked location, activity level, temperature, and feeding behavior for every animal in the herd, 24 hours a day, and sent alerts when any parameter fell outside the normal range. David had said, "We'll be able to catch health problems 2 days earlier than by visual observation. The data shows it." Thomas had said, "The data shows it on the farms and the trials." "This farm isn't different from the trial farms," David said. Thomas had not argued. He had watched the system run through the fall. He had noted when the system caught something he had already seen. He had also noted when he saw something the system had not flagged. In February 2019, in the worst ice storm in the Flint Hills in 27 years, the system failed completely. Power outage, satellite uplink down, backup battery drained. Thomas Aldridge found all 23 separated animals. In the dark. In ice. Without a system. By reading the herd. Thomas Aldridge drove his pastures on the first Saturday of September 2018 in the same way he drove his pastures every first Saturday of September, slowly, in the old Chevy pickup that had been replaced twice and that he kept anyway because the seat fit his back and because the sound of its engine was familiar to the cattle in a way that a newer engine was not. He was 72 years old, built in the lean and angular way of a man who has spent his working life outdoors in a landscape that provides no shelter from wind. His face was the color and texture of the Flint Hills themselves, weathered limestone, patient, without unnecessary features. He had a rancher's hands, large-knuckled, calloused at the specific points that matched the specific tools of his specific work. He drove the east pasture first, then the middle pasture, then the creek bottom, noting what he saw. He noted the condition of the 247 head that were on pasture, body condition score, coat quality, movement, the specific posture of animals that were eating versus animals that were standing in ways that suggested something other than eating. He noted the grass condition, the water level in the stock tank, the behavior of the pasture itself, which was a thing Thomas Aldridge understood and that most people who drove through the Flint Hills saw as merely scenery. In the seat behind him, his border collie Lena watched the same things he watched, from a different angle. He did not write most of what he noted. He kept a notebook for the things that required explicit recording, deaths, calving dates, weight gains at shipping, the specific treatments for specific animals. The rest he kept in the way he had been keeping it for 52 years, in the pattern recognition that had been built observation by observation since he was 20 years old, and his father had handed him the responsibility for the east pasture and said, "Learn to read them." He had been learning for 52 years. In the field beside the creek bottom, he stopped the pickup. One of the cows, number 412, a 9-year-old Angus cross that he knew the way he knew individual members of his community, was standing slightly apart from the group. Her posture was unremarkable to anyone who had not been watching her for 9 years. To Thomas, who had been watching her for 9 years, the angle of her back feet was 2 degrees off her normal stance. He got out of the pickup and walked to her. He ran his hands along her right rear leg. She did not flinch at the hip but flinched fractionally at the stifle joint. He noted this in his notebook. 3 days later, when David came for the weekend and pulled up the RFID system's activity logs, the system showed that 412 had normal activity levels across all 3 days. She had eaten normally. Her temperature was within range. The system had not flagged her. "She has early joint inflammation in the right stifle," Thomas said. "She needs to come in for treatment." David looked at the system data. "The system shows nothing wrong with her," he said. "I know what the system shows," Thomas said. They brought 412 inches. The vet confirmed early joint inflammation. Treatment was straightforward. Another 3 days and it would have been more complicated. David looked at the system data afterward. "The system should have caught this," he said. "The system monitors what it monitors," Thomas said. "Activity level, temperature, GPS location. None of those would have shown early stifle inflammation. What shows early stifle inflammation is the angle of the back feet." "I'll talk to the vendor about adding gait analysis," David said. "Talk to them," Thomas said. George Aldridge had run cattle in the Flint Hills for 41 years, from 1941 to 1982, and the knowledge he had accumulated in those years was not organized in the way that manuals were organized. It was organized the way the Flint Hills were organized, by season and by weather and by the behavior of animals in specific conditions. He had taught Thomas the way the knowledge required being taught, not through instruction but through proximity. From the time Thomas was 8 years old, he had been in the pastures with his father, learning to see what his father saw. Most people, George had told him when Thomas was 12, look at a cow and see a cow. What you need to see is what the cow is attending to. What do you mean? Thomas had said. A cow is always attending to something, George had said. Sometimes it's the grass in front of her. Sometimes it's another cow 50 yards away. Sometimes it's something she can smell that you can't yet see. The animal's attention is information. What she's looking at and how hard she's looking tells you what's happening in the pasture. How do I know what she's looking at? Thomas had said. Her ears, George had said. Her eyes. The set of her head, the direction of her body relative to her feet. A cow who's standing with her body pointed one way and her feet planted another is in the middle of a decision. Follow the decision. Thomas had spent 40 years following the decisions. By the time he was 30, he could read the east pasture from the truck without getting out, could tell from the collective orientation of the herd whether something was wrong in the northeast corner, whether the water was low at the tank, whether a cow was in early labor. By the time he was 40, he could read the herd's history and its behavior, could see the lingering behavioral effects of a coyote incident 6 months ago and the way a specific group of cows still tended to bunch toward the center of the pasture when the light was low. George had died in 1988. Before he died, he had told Thomas one more thing. The hardest part, George had said, is knowing what you know. Not the knowing itself, the trusting it. You'll spend years building this knowledge and then you'll meet someone who says it's not real because they can't see it. They'll be wrong. Don't let them convince you they're right. Thomas had carried this instruction for 31 years. In September 2018, watching his son David read the RFID system data and find nothing wrong with a cow that Thomas knew had early joint inflammation, he thought about it again. David Aldridge was 44 years old and had been managing the ranch's operations alongside his father for 8 years, since returning from a decade in agricultural management consulting in Kansas City. He was a competent and thoughtful man who understood cattle ranching well. He had grown up in it, had worked every aspect of it from weaning to shipping. But what he did not have was his father's 52 years of watching this specific herd in this specific landscape. He understood this distinction. He was not a man who confused competence with mastery. He had installed the RFID system because he believed it would close some of the gap, not all of it, not the 52-year gap, but the gap between what the system could monitor continuously and what even his father could monitor in the time he spent in each pasture each day. His father was in the pastures 3 to 4 hours daily. The system was in the pastures 24 hours. The disagreement between them was not about whether the system was useful. Thomas acknowledged its value. It had caught a fever in a yearling that Thomas had missed, and the GPS tracking had located two animals through a fence in the night. The disagreement was about what the 412 incident implied. To David, it implied that the system needed better sensors, specifically gait analysis. To Thomas, it implied something different, that the system monitored variables, and that the relevant information was not always in the variables. It was sometimes in the relationship between variables, in the pattern that emerged when a cow's normal stance, feeding behavior, herd position, and the specific quality of her attention to her own movement were all integrated in a single observation. David had the conversation with his father 2 weeks after the 412 incident, on a Thursday evening when they were both in the barn doing a routine check on the calving cows. "Tell me what you saw in 412, David said. "Not the conclusion. What you actually saw." Thomas looked at him. This was a different kind of question from the one David had been asking. "I know her normal stance," Thomas said. 9 years of watching her. Her right rear foot sits at a specific angle when she's comfortable. On Saturday, the angle was off by about 2 degrees. 2 degrees, David said. "In her right rear foot," Thomas said. "Which is the foot she unweights when the right stifle is sore." "You were reading a deviation from her individual baseline," David said. "Yes," Thomas said. "And the baseline is 9 years of observation," David said. "Yes," Thomas said. David was quiet. He was thinking about what it would take to build that baseline computationally, to track, for 247 individual animals, the normal stance angle of each foot in each physiological condition, so that a 2-degree deviation was readable as a signal rather than noise. "The gait analysis sensor would catch this," he said. "If it's calibrated to individual animals." "It would catch some of it," Thomas said. "The foot angle in the data. It wouldn't catch that the 2-degree deviation is specific to early stifle stress rather than fatigue, which I know because I've seen 412 stifle stress twice before, in 2014 and 2017. "So the sensor gives you the signal," David said. "You give it the interpretation." "Yes," Thomas said. "If someone is watching." "That's a different model," David said. "Not sensor replacing observation. Sensor supporting observation." "That's what it always was," Thomas said. "Except the model assumes someone was still doing the observation." David thought about this for a long time after he went home that night. He thought about the assumption embedded in the RFID system's design, that continuous monitoring could substitute for expert observation, rather than complement it. He thought about what would happen to the ranch's herd management when Thomas retired and the expert observation was no longer present to interpret what the sensors were showing. He did not resolve the thought. He put it aside and went to sleep. He would not fully resolve it until February 2019. The Flint Hills in winter are a specific landscape that requires specific understanding. The hills are not gentle, they are the exposed fossil seabed of a Permian-era inland ocean, chert and limestone breaking through thin soil, running in north-south ridges that channel the wind in ways that can turn a manageable cold front into a survival event for cattle exposed on the wrong slope. The wind that comes through the Flint Hills in winter has nothing between it and the Rockies to slow it down. The grass, the native bluestem and Indian grass and Sidiotes grama that has been the foundation of Flint Hills cattle production for 150 years, goes dormant in winter but holds its nutritional value through the dry months. Most years. The year of the ice storm was not most years. The weather had been mild through December and into January, which was the kind of mildness that experienced Flint Hills ranchers viewed with suspicion rather than gratitude. The mild winters tended to end abruptly. Thomas had been watching the indicators since the end of January, not the Weather Service's models primarily, but the specific signs he had learned to read in 52 winters. The way the birds were moving. The behavior of the cattle in the weeks before the front arrived, a specific restlessness, a tendency to bunch toward the northeast corners of pastures, that he associated with falling barometric pressure. He noted in his notebook in late January, animals unsettled, bunching more than normal in northeast corner of east pasture. East pasture is most exposed to north-northwest wind. They know something is coming. He brought extra hay to the field shelters and checked the windbreaks in the creek bottom. He checked the gates that were most likely to ice over. He checked the stock tanks for the heating element function. David had seen the forecast on his weather app. The app showed temperatures dropping to 14 degrees with freezing rain starting Thursday night. The system will still be running, David had said. The battery backup should last 48 hours. Check the backup charge level, Thomas had said. David had checked it. The backup was at 87%. What neither of them had accounted for was that the ice storm would last 72 hours, not 48. Ellen Aldridge had been married to Thomas for 48 years and had managed the ranch's financial records for the same period, because she was better with numbers than Thomas and because Thomas had understood this from the beginning and had never treated it as anything other than the operational division of labor it was. She kept the records in the specific way that a rancher's wife who is also the operations accountant keeps records, precisely, with the attention to detail that comes from knowing that the records are the only documentation of an operation that is otherwise entirely tacit. She had started a new section in the records after the September 412 incident. She called it, in the margin of the ledger, the observation premium, her term for the documented financial value of incidents where Thomas's behavioral observation had caught something that the RFID system had not, or had caught earlier, with clear financial implications. The 412 incident was the first entry. Cost of treating early joint inflammation, $340. Estimated cost if treatment had been delayed 3 additional days, $1, $200 to $1, $800, plus potential loss of productive future estimated at $2, $400. Observation premium, $1, $760 to $3, $860. She had been thinking about this documentation since September, and in late January 2019, when the storm forecast was building, she brought the ledger to Thomas. "I want to show you what I've been tracking," she said. She walked him through the 7 incidents since September, each one a case where his behavioral observation had caught something that the system had not flagged, each one with a documented financial implication. 7 incidents, combined observation premium of approximately $14, $200. Thomas looked at the numbers. "You've been quantifying the premium," he said. "The system costs $180, to install and ongoing maintenance," she said. "David made that investment to close the gap between what you know and what can be monitored continuously. The question the ledger is asking is, how large is the gap he didn't close?" "The gap is large," Thomas said. "That's what the 7 incidents show," Ellen said. "In 4 months." She paused. "But the 7 incidents are only the ones I can document clearly. You catch things in the pasture every week that don't rise to this level, things you correct before they become incidents." "The prevention is invisible," Thomas said. "The prevention is always invisible," Ellen said. "That's the problem with prevention. The system catches things the system catches. You catch things the system can't catch. Neither record shows what you prevent." Thomas looked at her. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because the storm is coming," Ellen said. "And the storm is going to test both systems simultaneously. And I want the record to be ready when it does." She paused. "And because David installed the system to close the gap," she said. "He should see the full size of the gap he's working with." Thomas nodded. "After the storm," he said. "After the storm," Ellen said. She wrote in the margin of the January entry, "Storm forecast Thursday. Battery backup at 87%, rated 48 hours. If storm exceeds 48 hours, both systems will be tested separately." She did not know what the storm would show. She knew it would show something. The ice storm arrived on Thursday evening, February 12, 2019, ahead of the Weather Service forecast by approximately 4 hours. Thomas had known it was coming early. The cattle had known since Wednesday afternoon, a specific behavioral shift, the herd compressing toward the windbreak areas, animals that normally ranged furthest from the creek bottom moving voluntarily toward the shelter provided by the cottonwoods and the creek bank. He had moved additional hay to the windbreak areas on Wednesday evening, working in the fading light until he had satisfied himself that there was sufficient hay for 60 hours of storm. The RFID system was running. The satellite uplink was active. David had called from Wichita. He would drive out Friday morning as soon as the roads allowed. "The system will alert you if anything goes out of range," David had said. "I know," Thomas had said. The ice started at 7:30 p.m., ahead of the 11 p.m. forecast. It was freezing drizzle that built incrementally, coating every surface with a layer of clear ice that increased in thickness through the night. By midnight, the ice on the fence lines was a 1/4 inch thick. By 2 a.m., the gates were freezing into their latches. At 3:15 a.m., the power went out. The RFID system switched to battery backup at 3:15 a.m. Thomas was awake. He had been awake since 1 a.m., listening to the ice accumulate on the roof and calculating what it was doing to the pastures and the animals in them. He got up at 3:30 a.m. and dressed and went to the machine shed. Thomas took the 4-wheel drive ATV, not the pickup, which could not navigate the ice-covered slopes in the dark, and drove to the east pasture at 4 a.m. The ice was significant. 1.5 inches on flat surfaces, more on the windward slopes. The ATV's tires cut through the ice with a sound that was specific to these conditions, the specific crunch and squeal of ice under a rubber tire on frozen grass, and Thomas read the sound the way he read everything on this land, as information. The sound told him, the ice layer was uniform across the east pasture flats. The tire broke through cleanly. The grass underneath was holding the ice from the soil surface. The cattle on the east pasture were mobile if they needed to be. He drove to the windbreak area and found the main group of the herd clustered near the cottonwoods, standing in the close proximity that cattle use to share body warmth. He did a rough count in the truck's headlights, approximately 180 animals. The east pasture carried 220 animals not in the windbreak. He drove the east pasture's perimeter. He found 15 in a low area near the creek where ice had formed a shelf that provided some wind protection. He looked at the 15 for a long time, read their posture, their orientation, the direction their heads were pointing. Several of them were oriented northeast, toward the fence line. He drove to the northeast fence line. The fence had a section that he had been meaning to rebuild since fall, a post that had been loosening in the soil through the wet autumn and that he had shored up with wire ties but had not replaced. The ice had put additional tension on the wire. In the dark and the ice, it was hard to see exactly what had happened, but the posture of the 15 animals in the creek bottom told him what had happened before he got to the fence. They were looking toward where the fence had been. The section was down. 5 animals had gone through. He noted the location and drove to find the 5. Thomas Aldridge had learned, over 52 years, that a separated animal's location in conditions like these could be read from the behavior of the animals that had not separated. The logic was simple but required knowledge of the specific herd to apply. Cattle are not indifferent to each other. Animals that have been in the same pasture together, that have established social positions and forging partnerships and the specific proximity relationships that a herd develops over time, are aware of each other's absence. The awareness manifests in behavior, in the orientation of animals toward the direction from which an absent herd member is expected to return, in the specific quality of alertness that a herd maintains when its composition has changed. Thomas drove back to the windbreak and looked at the 180 animals clustered near the cottonwoods. He looked at their collective orientation. Not all of them were facing the same direction, that was not how it worked. But among the animals in the outer ring of the cluster, the ones whose orientation was least constrained by the compression of the group, several were pointed consistently northeast. Northeast was the direction of the down fence section. He drove northeast. Beyond the down fence was a section of land that Thomas had not owned since 2003, when he had sold 40 acres to a neighbor during a difficult financial year. The land was fallow now, brushy in the northeast corner, with a ravine that Thomas knew well because he had managed it for 30 years. He drove to the ravine. 3 of the 5 separated animals were in the ravine's sheltered lower section, where a limestone outcrop created a windbreak on the north side. He drove them out and back through the down fence section, working slowly in the ice, and returned them to the windbreak group. 2 animals still missing. He went back to the windbreak and read the herd again. The herd's orientation had shifted slightly. The northeast pointing animals had relaxed their attention. The 3 returned animals had rejoined the group and the social composition had adjusted. But 3 or 4 animals on the east side of the cluster were now oriented east-southeast, toward the creek bottom but below the section where he had found the 15 animals earlier. He drove east-southeast. The creek bottom below the 15-animal group had a culvert crossing, a concrete pipe under the ranch road that drained into a lower section during heavy rain. The ice had changed the drainage pattern. Water that would normally flow through the culvert was backing up, creating a sheet of standing water under ice in the low area adjacent to the crossing. 2 animals were standing in the iced-over low area, their legs breaking through the ice with each step. Thomas got out of the ATV and worked the animals out on foot, using his body position and the knowledge of how these specific animals responded to human approach that he had accumulated over years of working them. He did not rush. He moved in the specific way that allowed these animals, in these conditions, to move away from the ice without panic. It took 40 minutes. At 6:45 a.m., he had all 200 animals in the east pasture accounted for. The RFID system battery had died at 6:30 a.m. The system had been offline for 3 hours and 15 minutes. 2 of those hours, Thomas had been finding the 5 separated animals. He drove back to the farmhouse in the growing light of the February morning and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and looked at his hands. David Aldridge arrived at the ranch at 11:30 a.m. on Friday, when the roads had been cleared sufficiently for travel. He found his father in the machine shed doing post-storm equipment maintenance. "How did the night go?" David said. "East fence section is down," Thomas said. "Post I was meaning to replace. 5 animals went through." David looked at his phone, which showed the system was offline. When did the system die? 6:30 this morning, Thomas said. Battery ran out. 72 hours instead of 48. When did the animals go through the fence? Sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., Thomas said. I found them starting around 4:30. You found them, David said. How did you know they were separated? I drove the pasture, Thomas said. When I couldn't account for 20 animals at the windbreak, I drove the perimeter. And found them? Found 15 in the creek bottom, Thomas said. Found the down fence. Then read the herd to find the other 5. David looked at him. Read the herd? The animals in the windbreak were oriented northeast after I found the 15, Thomas said. Northeast is where the fence went down. 3 of the 5 were in the ravine on the Simmons property. 2 were in the low area at the culvert crossing. They'd gotten into the iced-over drainage pooling there. You used the herd's collective orientation to find the separated animals, David said. Yes, Thomas said. David was quiet for a long moment. Even if the system hadn't been dead, he said. Even if it hadn't been dead, Thomas said, the system would have shown me that 2 animals had low activity readings and that their GPS signals hadn't moved in several hours. It would not have shown me the direction to look for them. Because the system tracks the separated animals, David said. Not the herd's awareness of the separation. The separated animals were 2 miles from the windbreak in a drainage pooling in a storm, Thomas said. Their GPS signals would have been approximate. The culvert crossing is not in any map layer in the system. But the herd knew where they were, David said. The herd was oriented toward where they had gone, Thomas said. Not where they were at that moment. The herd remembered the direction of the separation. David looked at the machine shed floor. He looked at his father. He looked at the east pasture visible through the open door of the machine shed, where the cattle were moving back toward normal distribution in the post-storm morning. Tell me how to learn what you did last night, he said. Thomas looked at him. He had been waiting for this question for 8 years. Start walking, he said. David stayed through the weekend after the storm, and on Sunday morning he walked the east pasture with his father for the first time as a student rather than as a manager. He had walked this pasture thousands of times in his life. He had managed it for 8 years. He had installed the monitoring system that was supposed to serve it better. He had done all of this and had not, until the conversation in the machine shed on Friday, understood the specific category of knowledge that he did not have. What am I not seeing? He said, when they had been walking for 20 minutes. Thomas stopped. The 2 animals from the drainage, he said. Numbers 228 and 341. Where are they in the group? David looked at the herd. He could not tell. He did not know their positions well enough to read their current positions against any baseline. Middle of the group, Thomas said. Both of them. That's not their normal position, they're animals that typically graze at the periphery. He pointed. They're carrying the stress from Thursday night. They're seeking the protection of the center. And the 3 from the ravine? David said. Back in normal position, Thomas said. The ravine gave them enough shelter that their stress is already resolved. How do you know which ones they are? David said. I've been watching 228 and 341 for 11 and 8 years respectively, Thomas said. I know their normal positions in the group the way you know where people normally sit at a family dinner table. When they're not in their seats, you notice. David looked at the herd. He was trying to see what his father was seeing, and he could not. That's what 52 years produces, he said. That's what starts, Thomas said. I'm not going to be here in 52 years. But I'm going to be here for long enough that you can build a foundation. What's the foundation? David said. Watching with the right questions, Thomas said. Most people watch cattle and look for things that are wrong. The foundation is watching cattle and learning what normal looks like. What 228's normal position is. What 341's normal feeding behavior looks like. What the east pasture looks like on a Sunday morning in late winter with the herd in good condition. You need the normal before you can read the abnormal. How do I build the normal? David said. Walk the pastures every day, Thomas said. Not to find problems. To see the baseline. Write down what you see. Come back the next day and see how it's changed. That's what your notebooks are, David said. 52 years of baseline, Thomas said. That's what the notebooks are. Ellen Aldridge showed David the observation premium ledger on Sunday evening, when Thomas had gone to bed and she and David were sitting in the ranch office. She walked him through the 7 incidents from September through January, each one documented with the financial implication of Thomas catching something the RFID system had not flagged. Combined observation premium for the 7 incidents, approximately $14.200. This is what I can document, she said. These are the cases where I could trace the financial implication clearly. David read through each entry. And the storm? He said. She showed him the storm entry she had added that day. The 2 animals from the drainage, health costs avoided. Both animals showed signs of stress consistent with early hypothermia when the vet examined them Monday. Estimated cost of treatment if they had remained in the freezing water an additional 4 to 6 hours, $3.200 to $4.800. Observation premium, $3.200 to $4.800. $17,000 total, David said. In 4 months, Ellen said. In documented incidents. What Thomas catches every week that doesn't rise to this level, the prevention that never shows up in any ledger because it was prevented, I can't quantify that. The system catches what the system catches, David said. He was echoing what she had written in September, which he had not seen until now. The system caught things this fall that Thomas missed, she said. The yearling fever. 2 fence crossings at night. The system has real value. 31,000 in documented RFID value, David said, looking at the comparison column she had prepared. Against 17,000 in documented observation premium, she said. Both real. Both incomplete. The difference is that the RFID value is already captured, it's in the system. The observation premium is in Thomas. And it leaves when he leaves, David said. Unless you build it, Ellen said. She had one more item to show him. She opened the notebook she had been keeping since September, not the financial ledger, a separate notebook, the observational record she had been building in parallel. I've been writing down what Thomas says when he's in the pastures, she said. Not formally, just notes, things he says that I want to have a record of. She handed him the notebook. He read through it. It was not long, 12 weeks of observations, in Ellen's precise handwriting, the things Thomas had said in passing about specific animals and specific behaviors and specific patterns. This is 30% of what he knows, David said. He was thinking about the distinction his father had made in the barn conversation, the part that can be articulated and the part that can only be learned through watching. Probably less than 30%, Ellen said. What he says when he's walking is the surface of what he's reading. The rest is in him. The rest requires being there, David said. The rest requires being there while he's still here to explain what you're seeing, Ellen said. That's different from being there after he's gone. David looked at the notebook. He looked at Ellen. How much time does he have? He said. Active pasture work? Ellen said. 3 to 5 years, at his current health. Longer if the terrain allows. The slopes are becoming harder for him. 3 to 5 years, David said. Start tomorrow, Ellen said. Not Monday. Tomorrow. David asked his father to walk the east pasture with him on Monday morning, the way Thomas had walked pastures with his own father in the year before George's death. They walked from the farmstead east, in the February cold that had followed the storm, across ground that was still ice-rutted in the low spots. Thomas walked the way he always walked a pasture, watching the cattle, not the ground he was stepping on. His feet knew the ground. His attention belonged to the herd. Show me what you see, David said. Thomas walked for a while without speaking, letting the pasture say what it was saying that morning. The 2 animals from the drainage, he said finally. Still in the middle of the group instead of their normal peripheral positions. They're still carrying Thursday night. And the 3 from the ravine? David said. Back in normal position, Thomas said. He pointed. 341 is there, at the south end of the middle cluster. 228 is there, at the edge of the east group. David looked. He could not distinguish them. Their ear tag numbers are 228 and 341, Thomas said. I know their normal positions in the group. When they're not in their seats, I notice. That's what the calibration is, David said. Knowing where everyone normally sits. Yes, Thomas said. You start with the dominant animals, the ones whose position anchors the group's composition. Then the animals and their social satellites. You build it from the center out. How long to know the dominant animals well enough? David said. 1 calving season, Thomas said. To know them well enough to track their positions. 2 to 3 seasons to know them well enough to read deviations. And the full herd? David said, for this specific herd, in normal conditions, 3 years before you can trust it consistently, Thomas said. 5 before you can trust it in emergency conditions like Thursday. 5 years, David said. If you walk every day, Thomas said. Not just when something is wrong. Every day. They walked to the northeast corner, the fence that had failed in the storm, now temporarily wired. The 3 animals I found in the ravine, Thomas said. They came back through this section. You can see it in the way they avoid this corner now. They'll avoid it for the rest of the winter. By spring, it will be gone. David looked at the corner. He looked at the herd. He could not see which 3 animals were avoiding the northeast corner. Start now, Thomas said. Not the reading, the watching. You have to watch before you can read. The watching comes first. What do I watch for first? David said. The dominant cows, Thomas said. There are 3 in this pasture whose positions anchor the whole group's composition. Learn their normal positions. Learn their normal behaviors. Start there and work outward. Which 3? David said. Thomas pointed. David wrote down the tag numbers. The spring of 2019 was the first spring that David Aldridge walked the pastures systematically, the way his father walked them. He kept a notebook, not the same notation system as his father's, which was personal and partially indecipherable, but his own system, developed in conversation with Thomas about what was worth noting and why. The RFID system was running again, restored after the storm. David had decided against the gait analysis add-on, not because it lacked value but because Ellen's accounting had made the relative values clear, and the $48,000 for gait sensors would buy approximately 10 months of veterinary monitoring and supplemental labor that he thought was more flexible. In March, during the beginning of calving season, Thomas pointed to a cow, number 187, a 7-year-old, who was standing apart from the group with her head slightly lowered. What does that posture tell you? Thomas said. David looked at 187. She's uncomfortable, he said. Could be pre-calving behavior. It is pre-calving behavior, Thomas said. But which stage? David looked at her. He did not know. Early first stage, Thomas said. She'll calve in 8 to 12 hours. The angle of her back and the position of her tail tell you it's first stage, not active labor. She'll be moving to a more isolated position in 4 to 6 hours. The angle is a progression marker, David said. Each physiological stage shows in the posture, Thomas said. The posture is the visible expression of what's happening internally. David noted this in his notebook. 187 calved at 11 hours and 40 minutes later. First stage labor had lasted 9 hours and 20 minutes from the time Thomas had identified the posture, within the range he had predicted. David began keeping a prediction and confirmation log alongside the observation log, his own initiative, not his father's suggestion. He tracked predictions against outcomes and noted the specific observation error when a prediction was wrong. By the end of the spring calving season, he had 51 predictions with 32 confirmed and 19 disconfirmed, a 63% confirmation rate. His father reviewed the disconfirmation entries and identified the specific observation errors in each one. You're not reading the angle of the back feet, Thomas said, looking at the third disconfirmation entry. You're reading the angle of the back in isolation. The back and the back feet together tell you the stage. The back alone is incomplete. David added back feet observation to his notation protocol. By the fall calving season of 2019, his confirmation rate had risen to 71%. By the spring of 2020, 76%. The rate was improving as the observation library built, each confirmed prediction strengthening the calibration, each disconfirmation identifying a gap. His father's confirmation rate, across the full career, was approximately 91%. The gap was 20 percentage points. It was real, it was documented in the error log, and it was closing at approximately 4 to 5 percentage points per year. In April 2019, the RFID system vendor's regional sales manager, a man named Grant Phelps, 37 years old, who covered Kansas and Missouri, came to the ranch for a post-storm consultation visit. Grant was a competent and professional representative genuinely interested in improving the system's performance in the failure scenario that February had exposed. He had come with a proposal for an extended backup system that would provide 96 hours of operation in sub-zero temperatures. He was also, at David's suggestion, getting a tour of the pastures. Thomas walked the tour with them. He walked the tour the way he walked all pasture visits, watching the cattle. In the east pasture, Thomas stopped near the northeast fence corner where the 5 animals had been separated in February. Number 228, he said, pointing to an animal that Grant and David could not immediately distinguish from her neighbors. She's been avoiding the northeast corner since the storm. Watch her relative to the corner as we walk toward it. They walked toward the northeast corner. 228 turned and moved away from the corner as they approached it, more significantly than the animals around her. Specific. Not dramatic. Specific. She associates the corner with the stress from the storm, Thomas said. She'll maintain this avoidance pattern for another month or two. Then it will fade. Grant watched this. He sold behavioral monitoring systems. He had just watched a 72-year-old man identify a specific cow by her post-trauma behavioral pattern. Your system tracks location, Thomas said to Grant. Can it track the history of an animal's location relative to a specific fence section? We could build a heat map for any specific animal, Grant said. We do location tracking. The analysis would be custom built. If you built it, Thomas said, what would you see? We'd see that 228 spends less time near the northeast corner than before February, Grant said. Yes, Thomas said. And you'd see it in the aggregate data, 3 or 4 weeks after the behavior started. By which time I've been watching it for 2 months. Grant was quiet for a moment. What would close the lag? He said. Knowing what the behavior means before it shows up in the aggregate, Thomas said. Which requires knowing the baseline for this specific animal in this specific pasture, accumulated over years. Not a sensor problem, Grant said. Not a sensor problem, Thomas said. A reference problem. The reference is in me. Grant looked at the east pasture. He had been selling agricultural technology for 9 years and he was encountering, clearly and for the first time, the precise limit of what his technology could do. Is the reference transferable? He said. Partially, Thomas said. The general principles are transferable. The specific calibration, what 228's normal behavior looks like, so that the deviation is readable, that requires years of watching 228. David is building that calibration, Grant said. He started in March, Thomas said. He has some years to go. How many years do you have? Grant said. He said it directly, the way a professional asks a question that needs to be asked. Thomas looked at the east pasture. At the herd grazing in the April sun. At 228, who had moved back to her normal grazing position now that they were no longer walking toward the northeast corner. Enough, he said. If we start using them correctly. David Aldridge sat in the ranch office in May 2019 and did a calculation that he had been avoiding since February. The calculation was about time. His father was 72 years old. The productive active years of a Flint Hills rancher, the years of daily pasture work, of being physically able to walk every pasture and read every animal in every condition, ran to approximately 76 or 77 before health limitations required significant reduction. 4 or 5 years. David had been building the calibration since March. His confirmation rate was 63% at the end of the first calving season and rising. His father had said 5 years for routine conditions, longer for emergency conditions. 5 years of building against 4 or 5 years of his father's availability. The timelines did not align comfortably. He went to find his father. Thomas was in the calving barn, doing the evening check on the 3 cows that were close to their due dates. I've been calculating, David said, 5 years minimum for the calibration I need in routine conditions. 4 or 5 years of your availability for active pasture work. Yes, Thomas said. That's not enough margin, David said. No, Thomas said. It's not. What do we do? David said. Thomas thought about George's answer to the same question, given in different words in the fall of 1980, when George's health was beginning to decline and the transmission had begun in earnest. We use the time we have, Thomas said. Every walk. Every prediction. Every error. The calibration builds faster when you have the right framework for building it. What's the right framework? David said. The error log, Thomas said. The prediction and confirmation practice. Walking every pasture in every condition, not just the good weather mornings. That's the framework. And if I don't have enough time? David said. Then you have what you have, Thomas said. Which is more than you would have had if you hadn't started. The calibration I can transmit is limited. The calibration you build yourself is the part that has to survive after I'm gone. The part you transmit gives me the framework, David said. The part I build fills the framework with this specific herd on this specific land. And the part that can't be transmitted? David said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. That part goes with me, he said. That's always been true. It was true when your grandfather died. I had 18 years with him. I didn't get everything he had. You got enough, David said. I got enough for what the ranch needed when he was gone, Thomas said. Not to transfer everything. To transfer enough. The summer of 2019 was the most intensive learning period of David Aldridge's adult life. He walked the pastures every day that Thomas walked them. He kept the observation log and the prediction and confirmation log and the error log. He read his father's 40-year notebook archive, not to memorize it but to understand the framework, to see how the observations had been organized and what patterns had emerged over decades. In July, something advanced the learning in a way that a summer of normal observation would not have. A coyote pack worked the east pasture on a Tuesday night. Thomas had predicted it. On Monday, he had told David, "Watch the east pasture Wednesday morning. The coyotes have been working along the creek bottom. I can read it in the cattle's behavior at the east fence line. They'll try for a calf if we don't push them off." David had been in the pasture on Monday and had noted nothing unusual. The coyotes came Tuesday night. They did not take a calf. The cow herd responded with the coordinated defense behavior that cattle use against canine predators, and the pack withdrew. On Wednesday morning, Thomas and David walked the east pasture together and Thomas pointed to the behavioral signs of the incursion, the specific positioning of the cows with young calves, the alertness posture of the dominant cows at the perimeter, the way the calves had been moved to the center of the group and were still staying closer to their mothers than normal. "You can read last night's event in this morning's behavior," Thomas said. "The cows are still carrying the stress. The defensive pattern has relaxed but not completely dissolved." "And on Monday," David said, "what were you seeing that told you the coyotes were active?" Thomas walked back to the east fence line. "Stand here," he said. "Look at the fence line, not the herd. Now look at the herd. What are the animals nearest the fence doing?" David looked. "They're grazing normally," he said. "Look at the frequency of head lift," Thomas said. "A cow grazing at the fence line in normal conditions lifts her head to scan the environment how often?" David had not been counting. He did not know. "I've been watching this fence line for 50 years, Thomas said. "The normal head lift frequency at this fence line, in summer, mid-morning, is approximately once every 40 to 50 seconds. On Monday, the animals at the east fence line were lifting at once every 20 to 25 seconds. "Twice the normal rate," David said. "Twice the normal rate means they were detecting something that required increased environmental scanning," Thomas said. "I had two hypotheses, coyote activity or something in the north neighbor's pasture. The second I eliminated because the neighbor's cattle were undisturbed. So the inference was, unusual scanning behavior, no alternative explanation, therefore predator activity," David said. "Yes," Thomas said. "And I was standing at the same fence line on Monday," David said, "and I didn't count the head lift frequency." "No," Thomas said. "You weren't looking for it because you didn't know to look for it. Now you know." David noted head lift frequency at fence lines, baseline 40 to 50 seconds, elevated equals scanning for threat in his log. He had been in these pastures his whole life. He had not known to count head lift frequency. There were 50 more things like this. Things visible and obvious once you knew to look and invisible when you didn't. He had 4 years to learn as many of them as he could. Alan Aldridge sat at the desk in the ranch office in November 2019 and did the full accounting of the year. The observation premium through November 2019, 31 documented incidents, combined value approximately $47,000. The largest single incident was the February storm at approximately $4,800. The smaller incidents, early health detections, behavioral flags for calving assistance, the July coyote incursion that had allowed Thomas to move the most vulnerable calves away from the east fence line before the pack's arrival, accumulated to the rest. The RFID system's documented value over the same period, approximately $31,000 in health events caught by continuous monitoring and location tracking events. She looked at the two numbers. The observation premium, $47,000. The RFID system value, $31,000. She wrote in the margin, "These are not competing values. The system catches what the system catches. Thomas catches what Thomas catches. The overlap is partial." 3 of the 31 observation premium incidents were also flagged by the system, though later. The non-overlap is large, 28 incidents were not accessible to the system. The February storm incident was not accessible to any sensor on the market. Then she did the projection she had been building since the summer. If David continued improving at his current rate, approximately 4 to 5 percentage points per year in his confirmation rate, he would reach approximately 79 to 81% by year 3, and approximately 85 to 86% by year 5. Against Thomas's 91% career average, this left a gap of 5 to 6 percentage points at the 5-year mark. She calculated the financial implication of the gap. Each percentage point of confirmation rate corresponded to approximately $1,800 in annual observation premium, based on the current year's documented data. A 5 to 6 percentage point gap at year 5, approximately $9,000 to $10,800 per year in observation premium that David would miss that Thomas would have caught. The gap was real. It was documentable. It was also closing. She showed the projection to both Thomas and David. David read it and said, 5 to 6% gap at year 5. $9,000 to $10,000 per year. Approximately, Ellen said. Based on this year's incident data. The projection assumes the incident rate is stable, that the herd and the pastures continue to produce the same frequency of catchable events. And the gap in the transition year? David said. The first year after Thomas is no longer actively walking, Ellen said. Assuming you have 5 years of calibration built, approximately 20% below Thomas's current capability. Approximately $17,000 to $18,500 in annual observation premium that would have been caught. The transition cost, David said. The transition cost, Ellen said. Thomas had been reading the projection quietly. He set it down and looked at both of them. The projection assumes I stop walking, he said. I intend to walk for as long as I'm able. What the projection should show is not the transition year in isolation. It should show the trajectory, the observation premium as David's calibration builds over 10 years, against mine declining over the same period. Ellen had anticipated this. She turned to the next page of the ledger, where she had drawn the trajectory curves. 2 curves, converging. Thomas's capability declining gradually as his mobility declined. David's capability rising as his calibration built. The crossing point, approximately year 7. Year 7, David said. At your current learning rate and your father's current health trajectory, Ellen said. Year 7, David's observation capability exceeds Thomas's remaining capability. The baton is passed. And the gap between the curves? David said. The accumulated gap between what Thomas would have caught in years 1 through 7 and what David actually catches, Ellen said. Approximately $42,000 over the 7 years, based on current incident rates. She wrote at the bottom of the projection. The $42,000 represents the cost of starting in 2019 rather than in 2010. If David had begun the systematic observation and calibration building in 2010, when Thomas was 63 and his full capability was available for mentoring, the gap would be substantially smaller. The lesson is not that the current trajectory is inadequate, it is the best trajectory available given when the decision was made. The lesson is for the next ranch, where the decision has not yet been made. Thomas Aldridge walked the East pasture on the first Monday of March 2021, which was his last full spring of active daily pasture work. He was 74 years old. His hip had been replaced in December and his gait was different from what it had been, slightly effortful on the slopes, stable enough for the flat ground, but different. He knew the difference in the way that people know the changes in themselves, with the specific acknowledgement of a fact that has been visible for some time. David walked with him. David had been walking with him every day that Thomas walked for 2 years. He had 847 documented predictions with a confirmation rate of 79%, up from 63% in the first calving season of 2019. The rate was improving at approximately 4 to 5 percentage points per year. They walked the East pasture from the farmstead east. Thomas walked and read the way he had always walked and read, watching the cattle, noting what he saw, building the daily update to the reference library that 54 years of daily updates had produced. The 2 cows from the February storm, he said. 228 and 341. They'd been grazing the northeast corner since December. The avoidance has completely resolved. I noticed that in January, David said. You did? Thomas said. I've been watching the northeast corner since the storm, David said. 228 was grazing within 10 meters of the corner on January 14th. First time since the storm. I noted the date, January 14th, Thomas said. 23 months after the storm, David said. Thomas had known the avoidance had resolved. He had not noted the specific date. David had. You were watching something I pointed you toward, Thomas said. You documented it more carefully than I did. You gave me the framework, David said. I filled the framework with observation. That's transmission, Thomas said. Partial transmission, David said. Yes, Thomas said. Partial. You knew to watch. You watched. You saw. That's the chain. They walked to the northeast corner of the east pasture, where the fence had failed in the ice storm 2 years before. The new post stood solid in the frost-hardened ground. David looked at the northeast corner. He looked at the herd, which was distributed across the east pasture in the normal way of a March morning. What do you see? Thomas said. David, read the pasture. Normal morning distribution, he said. 228 and 341 in their standard positions. The 3 dominant cows on the west side, 103 on the north slope with their satellites. The yearlings on the south slope in the thin sun. 2 of the February calves close to their mothers, young enough to still be learning the pasture. Thomas listened. What are you not seeing? He said. David was quiet. He looked at the pasture again. Number 156, he said. I haven't placed her. Thomas pointed. Near the tank, he said. Back of the east group. David found her. At the tank. Not drinking, standing near the tank. Watching east. Yes, Thomas said. Watch her. They watched 156 for a minute. She's looking east, David said. Past the fence. The Simmons property. The neighbor to the north of Simmons has been running stocker cattle this winter, Thomas said. They've been coming to the North Simmons fence line. 156 has been standing near the tank for 20 minutes. I've been watching since we left the farmstead. She can smell them, David said. The wind is from the east, Thomas said. She's been the early detector for 6 years. She was the first animal to orient toward the coyotes in July. I should have noted that in my log, David said. Note it now, Thomas said. David took out his notebook and wrote, 156, early detector, external animal presence at fence lines. Documented, July 2019 coyote event, first to orient, March 2021 stocker cattle on North Simmons, standing near tank, east orientation, 20 plus min before herd response. Thomas watched him write. You're building it, he said. Slowly, David said. Slowly is fine, Thomas said. The speed isn't what matters. The continuity is what matters. Every day is one more day of baseline. Every day compounds. They walked back toward the farmstead through the March morning, through the land that had been in the Aldridge family's care since 1921 and that the animals that grazed it had been reading for 10,000 years before the first Aldridge arrived. The herd read the land. The stockman read the herd. The reading was a chain. Each link in the chain was imperfect. But the chain held. Thomas Aldridge did not walk the east pasture in the spring of 2024. He was 77 years old and his hip had developed complications in the winter that required reduced activity, and the east pasture's north slope was no longer practical for him in the early spring when the ground was wet. He walked the flat middle pasture with a cane and drove the creek bottom in the ATV, but the slopes were David's now. David walked the east pasture on the first Monday of April 2024 in the way that Thomas had walked it, slowly, watching the cattle, building the daily update to the reference library that 4.5 years of daily observation had produced. His confirmation rate was now 86%. His father's, across the full career, had been approximately 91%. The gap was 5 percentage points, approximately $9,000 per year in observation premium that Thomas would have caught and David missed. The gap was real. David tracked it in the error log. It was closing, at approximately 3 to 4 percentage points per year. In the east pasture that April morning, he found what he was looking for. Number 156, the early detector, the animal Thomas had first pointed out in March 2021, was standing at the northeast fence line with a specific east-facing orientation that David had now documented 19 times in 4 years. He noted the time, 7:22 a.m. Wind direction, east-northeast. 156's posture, feet planted, head up, ears forward. He drove around the perimeter to the north fence line and found 3 stocker cattle from the neighbor's property grazing against the fence, attracted by the early spring grass. He drove them back and returned to the east pasture at 8:15 a.m. 156 had returned to her normal grazing position. He noted, 156 early detection confirmed. 7:22 a.m., east fence orientation. Stock cattle confirmed north fence line. Detection to resolution 53 minutes. 156 first responder, 15-minute lead on herd response. He put the notebook in his shirt pocket and walked the rest of the pasture. At the northeast corner, where 228 had avoided for 23 months after the February 2019 storm, he stopped. 228 was dead. She had gone down in November 2022 with a liver condition that David had caught from behavioral observation, a slight change in her grazing pattern that he had noted in October and that had prompted a veterinary examination. The examination had been early enough for treatment, but the treatment had been palliative rather than curative, and she had died on a November morning with the cold coming in from the northwest. David had been with her. His log entry, 228 died November 14, 2022. Behavioral detection, October 3, 2022. 41 days from first behavioral sign to death. Treatment extended comfort period by estimated 4 to 6 weeks. Cost of treatment, $1, 200. This is the last entry for 228. He stood at the northeast corner and thought about the night of February 12, 2019, when his father had found 5 animals in ice and darkness by reading a herd that was missing part of itself. He thought about what his father had said, not to transfer everything. To transfer enough. He thought about his daughter Emma, who was 16 years old and who had been coming to the pastures with him since she was 12. She asked the right questions. She had started her own notebook in January, her own initiative, not his suggestion. He had found it in the truck last week and had read through it without telling her he had read it. The notebook showed a 16-year-old learning to watch before she could read. He would talk to her this weekend. Not a formal conversation, a walk. The same walk he had taken with his father in the week after the ice storm, when Thomas had said, "Start watching," and David had understood for the first time what that meant. He walked back to the farmstead through the April morning, through the land that the herd was already reading in the specific way that herds read the land they know, through the Flint Hills that looked the same as they had in 1921 and would look long after the last Aldridge was gone. The herd knew. The stockman was learning. The chain held. The Flint Hills of Kansas are real, approximately 4 million acres of native tallgrass prairie in east central Kansas, one of the largest intact tallgrass prairie ecosystems remaining in North America. The Flint Hills have been in continuous cattle production since the 1870s. RFID ear tag monitoring systems for cattle are real and in widespread commercial use. The systems described, tracking location, temperature, activity level, and feeding behavior, represent current commercial technology. Gait analysis sensors for cattle are a developing area of agricultural technology research. The behavioral reading described in this novel, the interpretation of individual and collective cattle behavior as a real-time information channel, is consistent with the scientific literature on bovine behavior and ethology. Research on stockmanship and low-stress livestock handling, including work by Temple Grandin and others, provides scientific context for the observational practices Thomas describes. The head lift frequency as a threat detection indicator, the post-trauma avoidance behavior, the collective orientation toward absent herd members, and the individual baseline behavioral patterns described are consistent with published research on bovine behavioral ecology. Thomas Aldridge, George Aldridge, David Aldridge, Ellen Aldridge, Emma Aldridge, Grant Phelps, and all other characters are fictional. The Flint Hills of Kansas are real. Ellen's calculation is fictional. The arithmetic it represents is not.